Okay, well, as you can see, I'm at home. It's Friday. And so when I have to do this on Friday, you get this different view and lighting, which probably isn't the best. But anyways, so we're on the last lesson in this quarter, and I'm entitling this The Blessings of Holy Living, because that's what this portion in Leviticus 26 gives us, is the blessing aspect of the conditional Mosaic covenant, which is very clear in this passage that it is conditional. If you obey my commands and statutes, verse 3, you get all these blessings. What the curriculum doesn't take us to in the lesson, which I think you need to go to just a little bit, is the fact that if they disobey, which starts at verse 14, they'll have all these cursings. They'll have all these punishments. And so let me read to you verses 27 through 34, because Israel doesn't obey the covenant. They have times in their history when they do, but for the most part, look at the first two verses. You shall not make idols for yourselves, or erect an image or pillar, etc., and then you shall keep my Sabbaths. Both of those things they did not do. Notice what the cursing element states starting at verse 27. But if in spite of this you'll not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you in fury. And I myself will discipline you sevenfold for your sins. You shall eat the flesh of your sons. You shall eat the flesh of your daughters. I will destroy your high places, cut down your incense altars, and cast your dead bodies upon the dead bodies of your idols. And my soul will abhor you, and I will lay your cities waste, and will make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not smell your pleasing aromas. And I myself will devastate the land, so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled at it, and I will scatter you among the nations. And I will unsheath the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate. And that's exactly what happened. You can go to the scriptures. I don't have time to give you all those scriptures, but Israel actually got to a point in their apostasy where they did sacrifice their children. They, of course, got carried away. Their land was devastated, and the land enjoyed their Sabbaths for 70 years. And that was an exact correlation to how they disobeyed the Sabbath. So as great as this curriculum is, and the 13 verses about the blessings and how positive that is, the reality is, a great lesson for us is that Israel did not enjoy the full blessings of God. They did not obey, and they paid dearly for it. So again, another thing about this, is important that you emphasize this is an this is a conditional covenant. And so the reason why God doesn't completely do away with Israel is not because they kept the Mosaic covenant, as a paragraph in this curriculum kind of almost implies, but because of the Abrahamic covenant, which was unconditional, despite their idolatry, despite their disobedience. God was going to fulfill those promises to Abraham, so that ultimately they would be a redeemed people, which doesn't happen until Revelation chapter 7 in a fullness, and they would receive the kingdom. So again, we need to keep these covenants in their proper distinction. We need to understand both of them. And I know that isn't the point of this lesson, but it needs to be brought out, because even in this curriculum, I see a blurring of that. And that leads to all kinds of problems with people confusing the church with Israel, etc. So, and like them, of course, we're commanded to obey a holy life. And so there seems to be a disconnect today, and this is something I think you should talk about in your lesson, with what that means. What does it mean to be holy? It seems that the Christian idea of being like Jesus is to love everybody and consider anything anyone else does or wants to do or wants to believe as being okay, that we should never stand up against sin or unbelief, as if Jesus of the New Testament is different than the God of the Old Testament, when, of course, they're one God. And that is a concept that I think we need to emphasize in this lesson. Even though we're not under the Mosaic law, we are under the moral laws that God has put into the Mosaic law that demonstrates his character and his holiness. And the New Testament basically reduplicates anything that is of a moral and spiritual nature regarding true sin in the New Testament. So yeah, the Mosaic law, the ceremonial laws, the sacrifices we are not under, but we certainly are under the concepts of worshiping only God and not being idolatrous, and of respecting him and setting aside time to worship him, etc. So we need to make sure that we understand our need to be holy. And how do we apply the blessings aspect? I think this is kind of an important thing that we walk carefully with, because if we don't, then what you end up with is a health and wealth mentality that if you obey God, you're never going to have problems. You're always going to have great wealth, etc. You're always going to experience economic blessings, and that is not the case. In general speaking, certainly God blesses us, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But a key context in this is the reality that the curriculum points out on page 146, second column, first full paragraph. These blessings and cursings were given to the nation. There was no promise to every individual in the nation that they would be wealthy or prosperous. Even this passage doesn't speak of wealth per se. It speaks of abundance. It speaks basically of God giving them the normal types of rains that they needed to grow healthy crops so that they would be provided for. I think to take this as any kind of huge wealth or prosperity is going beyond what is said here, even though God did often bless certain people with great wealth because of their obedience, both in the Old Testament times, and I would say he does sometimes do that now, but it's not a promise for every individual. I think there are basic promises of God providing for us, and a lot of times people don't feel like God's providing because they're not wise with what he's providing them with. He doesn't provide for us all the same way. But anyways, this is really a promise that their basic needs would be met. And as a nation, when they obeyed God as a nation, they flourished and they had peace, like in the days of David and Solomon. I mean, David, there was a lot of warfare, but we see all this victory in that warfare when they were living obediently. We also see times where they disobeyed and they paid for it. So as Christians, New Testament Christians, we do serve the same God. He loves us the same. He wants to bless us. But we're not Israel, right? So these promises, these blessing, cursings, this covenant was made to Israel. We're not Israel. America's not Israel. No other nation enjoys the same covenant relationship, and I think we need to make that clear to our people. However, as a rule, God blesses obedience. He even talks in the Psalms about, I think it's the Psalms, it might be a proverb that talks about God's blessings when righteousness reigns, etc. But it's not. We can't exactly take everything in these passages to Israel and apply them to ourselves or the New Testament church. In fact, I don't like the wording on page 146, second paragraph, under the commentary on verses 5 and 6, which states, although Israel would soon and did often break the covenant, God's promises persevered. Their sin did not annul his faithfulness. Now, this is a very misleading statement because they're saying this in the context of the Mosaic covenant. They should have worded it differently, that God didn't annul his faithfulness because of the Abrahamic covenant. God was faithful to the Mosaic covenant in that he cursed them and he judged them because they did not keep it. But he did not put them away as a people. He ultimately will redeem them because of the promises of the unconditional Abrahamic covenant. So that paragraph right there is a time for you to really kind of teach your people, teach your class that those two covenants work distinctively and yet in harmony, in the sense that ultimately God uses them for his purposes, but his ultimate blessing, his ultimate promised kingdom comes because of the unconditional covenant that he made with Abraham, because God's people as a rule did not obey. And the whole Old Testament is a testimony to their unbelief and their rebelliousness, not just in the 40 years, but beyond. And yet God promises to restore them, and the prophets keep bringing that up in both the minor prophets, especially the minor prophets and the major prophets. But the minor prophets will say, look, this is why you're in captivity, or this is why you went into captivity. You're being judged just as God said, but God will redeem you. God will remember his covenant with Abraham and restore you. So this lack of distinction between the two covenants is also seen in the curriculum on the top of page 48, when it says God's covenant promises to all those who trusted and loved him in the Old Testament are also his promises for those who trust and love him today. Well, no, not really, because we're not Israel. And so we don't have, as individuals, we're not part of Israel. And so we don't have the exact same covenant relationship. We're under the new covenant. And yes, under the new covenant, God does deal with us in a similar way. He does bless obedience. Okay, we do live in a sowing and reaping type of situation with God according to the New Testament. But let's teach that from the New Testament. Whatever applications we make in this passage need to be made through a New Testament lens, so that we don't start applying Old Testament promises that are strictly for Israel to ourselves. And so, we have to be careful, because those that haven't done that, many of them have fallen into a prosperity gospel. Because the mentality is, well, if I keep God's commands, which, by the way, how come we want to make a statement like that and not say, okay, then we're under all the obligations of this covenant? We're not under these obligations, right? We're not under the obligations of the Old Testament law. The moral and spiritual truths that transcend that, we are. But we don't have to keep the Mosaic law. Well, if they didn't keep the Mosaic law, they experienced the curses. So this is where these things get kind of, inconsistent. We need to be careful with interpretation, and careful with the difference between making applications that are consistent with New Testament truth. We can draw out from these things the character of God and the love of God and the blessings of God and the importance of obedience and holiness. But let's not get too, confusing about the fact that there are distinctions, and we need to bring that out. The curriculum doesn't bring that out. And so, again, that's why I don't like it when teachers start with application questions, because all of a sudden we're talking about applications to a passage we haven't taught the actual meaning of. Teach the actual meaning of the text, then bring in your applications. Okay, I hope that helps. Even if I say stuff you don't like, I'm just teaching you the truth. And I do it in love, and I hope it helps you, and I hope you have a great day. See you Sunday.